Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we explore the power of compassion, resilience, and standing up for what's right. Today's story follows Officer Marcus Williams, a ceremonial guard whose dedication is tested in the face of prejudice and injustice. Join us as we witness his journey of integrity, courage, and redemption. The summer sun blazed relentlessly over Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the historic symbol of American freedom and democracy. Tourists crowded the cobblestone square, their cameras raised high to capture every detail of the iconic building. The heat shimmered off the stone paths, making the air heavy and stifling. Despite the oppressive weather, Officer Marcus Williams stood stoically at his post, dressed in the ceremonial red, white, and blue uniform that symbolized both tradition and duty. Marcus, in his early 30s, had served as a ceremonial guard for over 6 years. For him, this wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Every detail of his presence, from his crisp posture to the gleaming polish of his boots, spoke of the pride he took in his role. But today, as the sweat trickled down his neck beneath his tall, black hat, he felt a weight beyond the sun's glare, a subtle tension that came from the crowd gathering around him. Among the throng of tourists stood Karen Miller, a blonde woman in her late 40s, with a sharp voice and an even sharper tongue. Karen had arrived that morning with her young nephew, Jacob, a curious boy of 10 who clutched a miniature figurine of a ceremonial guard. Jacob was eager to see the changing of the guard, but Karen seemed less interested in the history and more focused on making a spectacle of herself. It started innocently enough. Karen snapped a few photos of Marcus, her camera angled to capture his disciplined stance. But soon, her focus shifted, and her voice pierced the air like a blade. "Hey, soldier boy," she called out, her tone laced with mockery. "Why don't you smile for the camera?" Marcus didn't flinch. His training had taught him to remain impassive, no matter the provocation. But inside, a flicker of irritation sparked. He had faced countless taunts over the years, many of them rooted in ignorance or prejudice. Yet, he always held firm, knowing that his role represented more than himself. It stood for history, integrity, and the ideals of inclusion. Karen, emboldened by his silence, continued. "What's the point of having guards if they don't even look American?" she sneered, her voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. A few tourists chuckled nervously, unsure whether to intervene or walk away. Jacob tugged on her sleeve. "Aunt Karen, stop it. He's not doing anything wrong." Karen waved him off dismissively. "Oh, Jacob, don't be so sensitive. It's just a bit of fun. He doesn't even care." But Marcus did care. The words cut deeper than Karen realized, not because of their originality. He'd heard far worse, but because they challenged the very essence of why he stood there. To her, his presence was an affront, a challenge to her narrow understanding of what tradition should look like. As the changing of the guard began, the tension in the air thickened. The other guards marched in perfect unison, their movements precise and practiced, while the regimental band played a stirring melody. For many, it was a moment of awe and respect. But for Karen, it was another opportunity to provoke. "Look at him," she said loudly, pointing at Marcus, standing there like a statue. "Can't even defend himself. Can he?" Her words drew a mix of reactions from the crowd. Some whispered in disapproval, while others glanced awkwardly at Marcus, searching for a reaction that never came. Jacob looked up at his aunt, his face scrunched with confusion. "Why are you being so mean to him, Aunt Karen?" Karen rolled her eyes. "Mean? Don't be ridiculous. Jacob, it's just a bit of harmless teasing. Besides, he's probably used to it." But Marcus wasn't immune. Beneath his composed exterior, a storm brewed. He remembered the countless hours of training, the sacrifices he'd made to earn his position, and the pride he felt every time he donned the uniform. Yet here he was, reduced to the target of Karen's derision, his dignity chipped away one insult at a time. As the ceremony continued, Karen's behavior escalated. She pulled out a bag of peanuts from her purse and handed it to Jacob. "Here, throw one at him. Let's see if he moves." Jacob hesitated, looking at the peanut in his hand and then at Marcus. But he's not doing anything wrong. Karen's voice grew impatient. Oh, come on, Jacob. Don't be such a baby. It's just a joke. Reluctantly, Jacob tossed a peanut, which bounced harmlessly off Marcus's boot. Karen laughed, her amusement echoing loudly. See? Not a single twitch. He's like a mannequin in a costume. Marcus remained motionless. But inside, his patience frayed. The peanut wasn't just an object. It was a symbol of the casual disrespect he faced daily. And though Jacob was a child, it was Karen's goading that turned innocence into cruelty. A nearby security guard, noticing the commotion, approached Karen. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop," he said firmly. "These guards are here to represent our nation's heritage, not to entertain you." Karen crossed her arms defiantly. "Oh, come on. It's just a bit of fun. No harm done, right?" The guard's expression didn't waver. "Ma'am, this is a serious matter. Please step back and show some respect." Karen huffed but complied, retreating a few steps with Jacob in tow. For a brief moment, Marcus felt a sense of relief. Perhaps now, the ceremony could proceed in peace. But Karen wasn't finished. As the ceremony reached its climax, her irritation boiled over. "He's not even a real American," she shouted, her voice slicing through the air. "Why do they let people like him wear the uniform?" The words hung in the air, sharp and venomous. Marcus's chest tightened as he fought to remain composed. He thought of his ancestors, who had fought and struggled to carve out a place in this country. He thought of the young black boys who might one day look at him and see a reflection of their own potential. And he thought of the dignity he owed himself, even in the face of such blatant disrespect. The ceremony ended, the guards marching off in perfect formation. But for Marcus, the battle was far from over. Karen's taunts had left a mark, not on his uniform or his stance, but on the ideals he had sworn to uphold. And as the crowd began to disperse, he knew that this day was only the beginning of a test that would challenge not just his role as a ceremonial guard, but his very identity as a representative of what America could and should stand for. The afternoon sun bore down relentlessly on Independence Hall, the sweltering heat causing the crowd to shift uncomfortably. Marcus Williams, standing motionless at his post, maintained his unwavering stance. Despite the beads of sweat trickling down his neck, he had endured Karen Miller's taunts throughout the ceremony. But now, with the formalities over, the atmosphere grew even more charged. Karen, emboldened by her earlier antics, refused to let the day end without creating more drama. Her voice rang out sharply as she stood near the barricade, addressing her nephew, Jacob, who clutched his miniature guard figurine. "See, Jacob? He doesn't even flinch. That's why he doesn't belong here. He's all for show, not substance." Jacob looked down at his toy, visibly uncomfortable. "But Aunt Karen, isn't he supposed to stand still? That's his job, right?" Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, Jacob, you're too naive. A Real Guard would have discipline and pride. This 1 inch," she gestured at Marcus, "is just pretending." Her words carried through the thinning crowd, catching the attention of a few remaining onlookers. Some frowned in disapproval, while others whispered among themselves, unsure whether to intervene. Marcus, however, remained silent, his focus trained on the horizon. Years of training had taught him to withstand provocation, but Karen's persistence gnawed at his resolve. As Karen turned to leave, Jacob's toy guard slipped from his hand, tumbling through the barricade and landing near Marcus's feet. "My toy!" Jacob cried, his voice filled with distress. He tugged at Karen's sleeve, but she rolled her eyes dismissively. "Leave it, Jacob. It's not worth the trouble." "But it's my favorite. Dad gave it to me," Jacob pleaded, his eyes welling with tears. Karen groaned in exasperation before fixing Marcus with a cold glare. "Hey, you, pick up the toy for the boy, will you? It's right there." Marcus didn't move. His duty was clear: remain at attention and adhere to the rules. Any interaction with the crowd could be seen as a breach of protocol. Karen's voice grew louder. laced with mockery. "What's the matter? Too good to help a kid? Or are you just too lazy?" The crowd began to murmur, their unease growing. A security guard stepped forward, addressing Karen with firm authority. "Ma'am, please step back. This area is restricted, and the guard is not permitted to interact with visitors." Karen huffed, ignoring him. If he's so disciplined, why can't he bend down and pick up a toy? Ridiculous. Her frustration boiling over. Karen did the unthinkable. With a glance around to ensure no one was watching too closely, she climbed over the barricade, entering the restricted area. The act drew audible gasps from the few remaining tourists, who instinctively reached for their phones to record the unfolding scene. Marcus's grip on his rifle tightened as Karen strode toward him, her face twisted with indignation. "What kind of guard are you?" she spat. "Too proud to follow a simple request? You think that uniform makes you better than the rest of us?" She moved closer, her presence invasive, her words venomous. Marcus remained rooted, his mind racing to process the situation. Breaking protocol was unthinkable, but Karen's proximity was a blatant violation of boundaries. He could feel the tension building within him, a storm of anger and frustration barely contained. Karen's next move shattered the fragile equilibrium. With a swift motion, she raised her hand and slapped Marcus across the face. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, freezing the onlookers in shock. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Marcus's jaw tightened, his disciplined exterior masking the turmoil within. Years of restraint, of enduring countless slights and provocations, threatened to unravel in that instant. The crowd's murmurs turned into exclamations as Karen stepped back, feigning innocence. "I didn't mean to," she exclaimed dramatically, her voice rising to a wail. "I just tripped." He's overreacting. But Marcus's training took over, grounding him in the face of chaos. With measured precision, he raised his voice, his words cutting through the noise like a blade. "Halt!" The command carried weight, silencing the crowd. Karen froze, her bravado faltering under Marcus's unyielding gaze. He lowered his rifle slightly, maintaining control while asserting his authority. "You are in a restricted area. Step back immediately." Karen's expression shifted, her earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of fear. But as the crowd's attention turned to her, she quickly pivoted to playing the victim. "He grabbed me," she cried, pointing at Marcus. "I was just trying to help my nephew, and he attacked me." The nearby security guard, now joined by Marcus's superior, Captain Robert Hayes, approached swiftly. Hayes's expression was a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Officer Williams," he said sternly, "what is going on here?" Marcus's voice was steady but firm as he recounted the events. "Sir, this woman entered the restricted area, disregarded protocol, and physically assaulted me. I acted to protect my post and maintain order." Karen's voice rose again, shrill and accusatory. "He's lying. I just tripped. This is an abuse of power." Captain Hayes' sharp gaze darted between Karen and Marcus, weighing the conflicting accounts. The crowd, emboldened by the drama, began offering their versions of events, some defending Marcus while others supported Karen's fabricated narrative. Realizing the situation was spiraling, Captain Hayes made a quick decision. "Officer Williams, you're relieved from your post pending an investigation. Return to my office immediately." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He nodded curtly, his posture rigid as he stepped away from the scene. The murmurs of the crowd followed him as he made his way toward the administrative building, the weight of Karen's actions pressing heavily on his shoulders. Karen, meanwhile, smirked triumphantly as she rejoined Jacob, clutching the boy's toy guard. "That's how you handle people who think they're better than you," she muttered, oblivious to the damage she had caused. Jacob, however, looked up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Aunt Karen," he said quietly, "why did you hit him?" Karen waved him off. "Don't worry about it, Jacob. It's all part of the game." But for Marcus, this was no game. It was a test of everything he stood for, a challenge to his identity and his integrity. And as he removed his uniform in Captain Hayes' office, folding it carefully onto the desk, He couldn't shake the feeling that the values he had dedicated his life to defending were now being questioned, not just by others, but by himself. The battle wasn't over, but it had taken a deeply personal toll, one that would require strength, resilience, and a renewed sense of purpose to overcome. The late afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grounds of Independence Hall. Marcus Williams sat on a bench outside the administrative building, his ceremonial uniform now replaced with plain civilian clothes. The weight of the folded fabric, left behind in Captain Hayes's office, felt like the end of something sacred. Marcus stared at the tourists milling about, their laughter and chatter a sharp contrast to the storm of emotions brewing within him. He replayed the events in his mind, the taunts, the slap, the humiliation. It wasn't just about what Karen Miller had done. It was about what it represented. Years of service, discipline, and pride had been reduced to a spectacle. And the one thing Marcus had sworn to protect, his integrity, had been dragged through the dirt. Lost in thought, Marcus barely noticed the small figure approaching him until he heard a timid voice. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus looked up to see Jacob, Karen's young nephew, clutching the miniature figurine of the ceremonial guard to his chest. His wide eyes were filled with uncertainty and fear. "Have you seen my aunt? I got separated from her in the crowd." For a moment, Marcus's first instinct was to dismiss the boy. After all, wasn't he part of the problem? But as he looked into Jacob's tearful eyes, he saw something else: innocence, confusion, and perhaps even regret. Sighing deeply, Marcus gestured for the boy to sit beside him. "No, I haven't seen her," Marcus said, his voice low but calm. "But I'll help you find her." Jacob climbed onto the bench, sitting awkwardly with his toy figurine still clutched tightly. "I didn't mean to throw the peanuts at you," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Aunt Karen told me to. I didn't think it would hurt you." Marcus studied the boy's face, his expression softening. "Sometimes, people ask us to do things that aren't right," he replied gently. "It's up to us to decide if we should listen or not. Do you understand?" Jacob nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. "Aunt Karen said you weren't a Real Guard, but I think she's wrong." The words, so simple and honest, struck Marcus deeply. He placed a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Thank you, Jacob. That means a lot." As they stood to leave the bench and begin their search, a commotion drew their attention to the far end of the grounds. Karen's voice was unmistakable, sharp and full of venom. She stood near another black ceremonial guard, hurling insults that echoed across the square. "Why don't you smile? Huh? Or do they train you to look miserable all day?" The guard remained motionless, adhering to his training, but Marcus could see the tension in the man's stance. It was a scene all too familiar, and Marcus knew he couldn't stand by and watch it unfold again. "Stay close to me," Marcus told Jacob as they walked toward the confrontation. Karen turned as Marcus approached, her face twisting into a sneer. "Oh, look who it is," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "The ex-guard, come to play hero." Marcus stood tall, his voice calm but firm. "Enough. Karen, your behavior today has gone too far." Karen crossed her arms defiantly. "And what are you going to do about it? You're not even in uniform anymore." "I don't need a uniform to know right from wrong," Marcus replied. "You've insulted, harassed, and assaulted people all day. It ends here. By now." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the tension. Among them was Captain Robert Hayes, who had been observing from a distance. He stepped forward, his authoritative presence silencing the murmurs. "What's going on here?" Captain Hayes demanded, his sharp gaze moving from Marcus to Karen. Before Marcus could answer, Jacob spoke up, his voice trembling but determined. "Aunt Karen slapped him earlier," he said, pointing at Marcus. "She was saying mean things to him and told me to throw peanuts at him. I didn't want to, but she made me." Karen's face reddened, her bravado crumbling under the weight of Jacob's words. "You little brat," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "You don't know what you're talking about." Captain Hayes's expression darkened. "Is this true?" he asked, looking between Marcus and the boy. Marcus nodded. She crossed the barricade, insulted me, and struck me. I tried to maintain my composure, but the situation escalated. Karen's earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a look of panic. It was all a misunderstanding, she stammered. I didn't mean anything by it. Captain Hayes turned to the gathered crowd. Did anyone witness the incident earlier? If you have footage or can corroborate these accounts, step forward. Several tourists, emboldened by the captain's authority, came forward with their phones. Video evidence of Karen's actions quickly painted a damning picture. Her voice, her slap, and her dismissive attitude were all captured clearly, leaving little room for argument. As the truth unfolded, a police officer approached, summoned by the escalating situation. After reviewing the evidence and speaking with witnesses, the officer placed Karen under arrest for public disturbance and assault. Her protest fell on deaf ears as she was escorted away, her bravado replaced by a sullen silence. Jacob clung to Marcus, his small hands clutching the hem of Marcus's shirt. "What's going to happen to me now?" he asked, his voice small and frightened. A social worker from child services arrived, summoned by the police to ensure Jacob's safety. The woman knelt to Jacob's level, her voice soothing. "We're going to take care of you, Jacob. We'll make sure you're safe." Jacob turned to Marcus, his eyes filling with tears. "Will I see you again?" Marcus knelt to meet the boy's gaze, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I don't know, Jacob," he said honestly, "but I hope you remember something important. Always stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." As the social worker led Jacob away, the boy turned and waved, clutching his toy figurine tightly. Marcus watched him go, a mixture of sadness and hope swelling in his chest. He had lost his post, but he had gained something far more important, a chance to make a difference. Captain Hayes stepped forward, his stern expression softening. "Williams, I owe you an apology. I acted too quickly earlier, without understanding the full situation." Marcus nodded, his voice steady. "Thank you, sir." Hayes placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. The Royal Guard represents more than ceremony. It represents integrity, resilience, and the courage to stand against injustice. Today, you exemplified all of those values. Hayes's next words caught Marcus off guard. "I'd like to offer you your post back. We need guards like you, people who remind us of what we're truly protecting." Marcus stood straighter, the weight of the moment sinking in. "Thank you, sir. I'd be honored to return." As Marcus donned his uniform later that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The crowd had thinned, but one familiar face remained. Jacob stood at the edge of the square with his new guardian, waving enthusiastically. Marcus returned the gesture with a subtle nod, a quiet promise that his service, both in uniform and out, would continue. For Jacob, for justice, for the ideals that truly mattered. Thank you for watching this powerful story on Empathy Stories. Officer Marcus Williams' journey reminds us that standing up for justice and kindness can leave a lasting impact. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt tales. Together, let's spread empathy and make the world a better place. See you next time.